June 6, 1944. It was well past midnight. Silent shadows emerged over Normandy, gliding through the clouds. There was no engine noise, no propeller hum, only the faint rustle of wind striking wooden fuselages. These shadows were the harbingers of history's greatest amphibious invasion, and the men sitting inside these silent shapes would descend from the sky that night only to begin an entirely different battle the moment their feet touched the ground. If you're watching this video, you probably know a lot about D-Day, the bloody battles on Omaha Beach, paratroopers jumping into French territory under the cover of darkness, that massive armada approaching from the sea. But let me ask you something. How much do you know about glider pilots? Have you ever heard their story? Do you know what these men experienced landing in enemy territory in aircraft made entirely of wood without even an engine? If you enjoy stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe. This video is their story. The tale of forgotten heroes who took on history's most dangerous mission in single-use aircraft. And trust me, this story will shake you to your core. But before we begin, if this channel is new to you, we tell the lesser-known stories of heroism from World War II. A new video every day. Turn on those notifications so you don't miss a single story. Now, let's go back together to that dark night of 1944. Being a glider pilot was one of the most dangerous jobs of World War II. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was the most dangerous. To understand this, you first need to grasp what a glider actually was. A glider is a motorless aircraft. It has no ability to take off on its own. It gets attached to a tow plane and is pulled into the sky. When it approaches the target, it detaches from the tow plane and surrenders completely to gravity. From that moment on, the pilot tries to land using the wind, air currents, and his own skill. There is no chance of turning back. There is no engine. There is no second attempt. You either nail the landing or you crash. The British got into this early. In 1940, after the Germans captured the fortress of Eben Emael using gliders, Winston Churchill personally gave the order. Britain would establish its own glider force, and thus the Glider Pilot Regiment was born. This regiment would become one of the most elite units in the British Army, but their story was very different from that of an ordinary military unit. Do you know what a man who wanted to become a glider pilot had to be first? Above all, he had to already be a trained soldier. Everyone who applied to the Glider Pilot Regiment had previously served in another unit and completed basic military training. So these weren't ordinary pilots. These were men who were soldiers first, then pilots. And this was a crucial distinction. The training process was brutal. First came flight training. Candidates learned basic flying skills in light aircraft like the Tiger Moth. Then they moved on to Hotspur training gliders. The Hotspur was a small two-seater glider that taught pilots the fundamentals of motorless flight, reading the wind, feeling air currents, calculating glide angles. All of this was done without engine assistance, using only natural forces. But training wasn't limited to flying. Glider pilots also underwent intensive infantry training, weapons handling, grenades, close combat, terrain tactics, map reading, night operations. They learned it all. Because their job wasn't just to land the glider. After the glider touched down, that pilot would grab his weapon and join the fight. He would step out of the cockpit and become infantry. That's why the Glider Pilot Regiment's motto was so meaningful. It was, "Nothing is impossible." These men were truly versatile warriors, masters of the sky and soldiers on the ground, and this combination made them one of the most unique military forces in history. The Americans got into this as well. The United States started its glider program in 1941, and American glider pilots went through training just as grueling as their British counterparts. The American glider program was a bit chaotic at first. Training standards hadn't quite been established yet, but over time, American glider pilots became extremely capable. The main glider used by Americans was the Waco CG-4A. This glider could carry 13 fully equipped soldiers, or a jeep, or a light artillery piece. The Waco was the most produced glider of the war. Over 10,000 were built, and these gliders were used on every front from Europe to the Pacific. The British main combat glider was the Airspeed Horsa. The Horsa was larger than the Waco. It could carry 25 soldiers or a jeep with its crew. The Horsa was made almost entirely of wood. Its wings, fuselage, even the parts that touched the ground to reduce friction were all wooden. This wooden construction made the glider lighter but also made it fragile. In a crash, in a hard landing, the wooden fuselage could shatter into pieces. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe. And then there was the Hamilcar. The Hamilcar was the British giant glider. This beast could carry even a Tetrarch light tank. It had a payload capacity of 17 tons. The Hamilcar was the largest wooden aircraft in history, and flying it required incredible skill. Now think about this. You're a glider pilot. It's midnight, and you're over enemy territory. Behind you are dozens of soldiers or tons of ammunition. You have no engine. In the dark, under enemy fire, you have to land on terrain you've never seen before. You have one chance. You either succeed or you all die. This wasn't ordinary courage. This was the determination to face your own mortality and keep going anyway. Every glider pilot, before every mission, knew he might never return, and still they flew, still they landed, still they fought. In the planning of the D-Day operation, gliders would play a critical role. Paratroopers landed scattered across a wide area. The wind could blow them off course. They couldn't carry heavy equipment, but gliders were different. Gliders could land at a specific point as a group with heavy weapons. This was a tremendous tactical advantage. In the Normandy operation, British and American gliders would take on different missions. The British would capture critical bridges on the eastern flank of the operation. The Americans would secure the areas behind Utah Beach on the western flank. Both missions were extremely dangerous. Both missions would change history. The most important British mission was to capture Pegasus Bridge. This bridge spanned the Caen Canal and was vital to the success of the Normandy landings. If the Germans could use this bridge, they could send reinforcements to the beachhead. That could jeopardize the entire invasion, so the bridge had to be captured before the beach landings even began. The unit that took on this mission was D Company, attached to the 6th Airborne Division. The commander was Major John Howard, and they would land at the bridge with 6 Horsa gliders. 6 gliders, 180 men. The target, one of the best defended bridges in the world, at midnight, in the dark, in enemy territory. This looked like a suicide mission, but these men had been trained to make the impossible possible. Howard and his men prepared for this mission for months. In England, they found bridges resembling Pegasus Bridge. They practiced night landings. Every movement, every second was planned. The pilots were trained well enough to find the bridge even in total darkness. The soldiers developed tactics to neutralize the bridge defenses within seconds. This would become one of the best planned raids in military history. And then that night came. The night connecting June 5th to June 6th. At 10:56 p.m., 6 Horsa gliders took off from Tarrant Rushton Airfield in England. Each glider was attached to a Halifax bomber. The sky was cloudy, the wind was harsh, but the pilots were determined. They crossed the English Channel. The French coast came into view, and then, at 12:07 a.m., the first glider detached from the tow plane. There was no turning back now. Gravity was pulling them down. Enemy territory was approaching fast, and the pilots were searching for their target in the darkness. Jim Walwork and John Ainsworth were the pilots of glider number 1. In the dark, guided only by moonlight and inadequate light signals, they were trying to find Pegasus Bridge. They used everything they had learned in training. They calculated the wind, they adjusted their glide angle, and then, in the darkness, they saw the bridge. The landing was extremely rough. The glider touched down just 47 meters from the bridge. The impact was so violent that the cockpit shattered and both pilots were thrown from their seats. Walwork and Ainsworth were knocked unconscious, but the glider had reached its target, and the soldiers in the back burst out within seconds. The other gliders landed one after another. 5 of the 6 gliders touched down within hundreds of meters of the target. This was one of the most precise landings in the history of glider operations. In the dark, in enemy territory, without engine assistance, these men had reached their objective. The German sentries didn't even understand what was happening. These large wooden birds that came silently had suddenly appeared out of the darkness, and the soldiers emerging from them attacked with lightning speed. 10 minutes. In just 10 minutes, the bridge was in British hands. The enemy defenses had been crushed, the bridge was intact, and D Company had made history. This was an enormous success. But the battle wasn't over. For the pilots, the real fight was just beginning. After landing their gliders, these men were no longer pilots, they were now infantry, and ahead of them lay a long, bloody night. This was the fate of glider pilots. They descended from the sky like winged angels, but the moment they touched the ground, they left their wings behind, grabbed their weapons, and marched into the heart of death. Men who came in single-use aircraft then fought on the ground. This story isn't over yet. In part 2, I'll tell you about that long night at Pegasus Bridge, the struggle of glider pilots fighting as infantry, and the epic story of their American counterparts at Utah Beach. What did these men experience during that bloody dawn in Normandy? We'll see in part 2. But before you go, if you enjoyed this story, like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Had you ever heard about glider pilots before? What other lesser-known stories from World War II are you curious about? Let's meet in the comments. If you're curious about part 2, subscribe now, and let's move on to part 2. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2. We're continuing our story without slowing down. Pegasus Bridge had fallen into British hands. But this victory was only the beginning. Now came the truly difficult part. Taking the bridge was one thing, holding it was something else entirely. And on this long night, the glider pilots would prove that they weren't just good pilots, they were soldiers who would fight to the death. If you haven't watched part 1, go watch it now, because this story continues from there. I explained who the glider pilots were, how they were trained, and how they prepared for that historic night. Now we're going to experience the night itself. We'll see the battle at Pegasus Bridge, the struggle of pilots fighting as infantry, and the epic story of their American brothers behind Utah Beach. Are you ready? Before we start, hit subscribe and like. Let's continue. Now let's go back to the darkness of June 6, 1944. The clock showed 00:20. It had only been 10 minutes since the bridge was captured. Major John Howard stood on the eastern bank of the bridge, listening to his surroundings. The gunfire had stopped. The German sentries were either dead or had fled. But Howard knew this silence was deceptive. The Germans would counterattack soon, and the bridge defenses had to be strengthened before then. The glider pilots were a critical part of this defense. Jim Walwork and John Ainsworth had been knocked unconscious when the cockpit shattered, but they quickly came to. They were wounded but on their feet, and now they had work to do. Their piloting duties were over. Now they too were infantry. This transition was the most important part of glider pilot training. An ordinary pilot would be considered done once he landed his aircraft, but glider pilots were different. Their job didn't end with the landing. The landing was only the beginning of the second mission, and this second mission was usually far more dangerous than the first. After completing his piloting duties, Walworth grabbed his Sten gun and joined the defensive line. Ainsworth did the same. The pilots from the other gliders acted likewise. These men had landed their multi-ton wooden birds in the dark just minutes ago. Now they were in the trenches waiting for the enemy. The Germans' first counterattack didn't take long. Shortly after midnight, gunfire erupted from the western bank of the bridge. German patrol units had realized something had gone wrong at the bridge, and now they were trying to assess the situation. The first engagement was brief. The British held the superior position. They controlled the bridge and had established defensive positions. The German patrols were repelled. But everyone knew the real attack hadn't come yet. This was just probing fire. Around 1 o'clock, a more organized German assault began. This time, the enemy was more determined. Machine gun fire swept across the bridge. Grenades flew through the air, and the British were holding on by their fingernails. Subscribe for these heroes. The glider pilots played an active role in this defense. They hadn't only received flight training, they also knew infantry tactics. They had learned how to fight in trenches, how to move under enemy fire, how to use grenades, and now that training was paying off. Oliver Boland was the pilot of glider number 3. He had been slightly wounded during landing, but continued fighting. He took up position on the northern defensive line of the bridge. He opened fire on the enemy with his Sten gun. He saw German soldiers moving in the darkness. He took aim and fired. The enemy fell. Boland couldn't even remember how many times he fired that night. Everything was happening so fast. Dennis Edwards was one of the pilots of glider number 4. During landing, their glider had crashed into a fence and Edwards had injured his arm, but he too kept fighting. He could still use his Sten gun even with a wounded arm, and that night he did far more than piloting. He helped carry the wounded, he assisted with ammunition distribution, he ran from one end of the defensive line to the other. These were the moments that showed the true character of glider pilots. These men weren't just technicians who knew how to fly, they were warriors. When difficult moments came, they didn't run, they didn't step back. They left their wings behind and became warriors of the earth. As the night progressed, the fighting intensified. The Germans knew very well the strategic importance of the bridge. If this bridge remained in enemy hands, it would be a critical advantage for the Normandy invasion. So they were doing everything they could to retake it. Around 02, the Germans attacked with armored vehicles. This was a dangerous moment for the British. What could lightly armed infantry do against armored vehicles? But the British had an ace up their sleeve, the PIAT, or Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. This was the British anti-tank weapon, and several had been brought to the bridge during the glider operation. Sergeant Charles Thornton was one of the soldiers who would use the PIAT. When the German armored vehicle approached the bridge, Thornton kept his cool. He waited for the vehicle to come into range, and then he fired. The PIAT round struck the armored vehicle and it burst into flames. The German attack faltered. This event boosted the defenders' morale, but everyone knew ammunition was limited. PIAT rounds wouldn't last forever, and the Germans had more armored vehicles. If reinforcements didn't arrive, the bridge could fall. The glider pilots were everywhere on the bridge during these critical hours. Some were on the defensive line, firing. Some were collecting the wounded. Some were on communications duty, trying to establish radio contact. These men were just as valuable as infantry as they had been during every second of their piloting. And right at that moment, a gift came from the sky: paratroopers. The paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division had begun landing around the bridge. This was the planned reinforcement, and it was a huge relief for the glider pilots. With the arrival of the paratroopers, the defensive line strengthened. More weapons, more soldiers, more ammunition. The German counterattacks continued to be repelled, and as dawn approached, the bridge was still in British hands. But this is only half of the story, because that same night, friends from across the Atlantic were fighting their own battles. American glider pilots were going through their own hell behind Utah Beach. The American glider operation had a different character than the British operation. The British had made precise landings at specific points, bridges, specific targets, surgical operations. The Americans' mission was broader in scope. Their objective was to secure the area behind Utah Beach, control the roads, and clear the way for units advancing from the beach. The American glider operation took place in 2 waves. The first wave came in the early hours of June 6th, right at the start of D-Day. The second wave would land during daylight hours, after the beach landings had begun. Both waves would face challenging conditions. The glider elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were the backbone of this operation. Waco CG-4A gliders crossed the English Channel behind their tow planes, and as they approached French soil, hell began. The Germans had strengthened air defenses in this area. The tow planes and gliders entered intense anti-aircraft fire. The sky lit up with flak bursts and tracer rounds. The pilots were flying through the middle of death. Some tow planes were hit and went down. The gliders behind them were suddenly set free. The pilot had to make a decision instantly. He had to determine where to land within seconds. The planned landing zones were forgotten. Now, the only thing that mattered was survival. But surviving wasn't that easy, because the Germans had flooded the fields in the Normandy region. On Rommel's orders, river dams had been opened and wide areas had turned into marshland. In the darkness of night, these marshes looked like flat meadows, and pilots, thinking they were landing on flat grass, plunged into swamps. These marshes caused the deaths of many soldiers. Heavily equipped soldiers sank into the swamp. Gliders broke apart in the water. Those who managed to escape had to wade through the marsh for hours. This was a chaotic and deadly situation far outside the planned operation. Michael Murphy was a Waco pilot attached to the 101st Airborne Division. That night, while trying to land his glider in the dark, he couldn't see what was below. The landing looked flat, but the moment the wheels touched down, the glider plunged into water. Murphy and his co-pilot tried to escape the cockpit. The soldiers in the back were panicking. The water was rising fast. If you're finding this story interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe. Murphy kept his cool. He kicked the door open and got out. He was in water up to his waist. He turned around and helped the soldiers get out. He managed to save all of them, but the glider was gone. The equipment they were carrying was underwater. And now, in the middle of a swamp, in enemy territory, they had to figure out what to do. This story repeated itself hundreds of times that night. American glider pilots faced incredible difficulties in Normandy's chaotic skies and marshes, but they didn't give up. They got up from where they fell, they gathered the soldiers they rescued, and they kept fighting. Robert Butler was one of the glider pilots of the 82nd Airborne Division. That night, his glider crashed into a fence and the wings broke off. Butler was shaken but uninjured. The soldiers in the back were fine too, but they were miles away from the planned landing zone, and there were Germans around. Butler gathered the soldiers and got moving. His job as a pilot was done. Now he too was infantry. He pulled out his compass, looked at the map, and started walking. After hours of marching, they reached their own units. Butler had proven himself that night, not just as a pilot, but as a leader. The second wave of the American glider operation came during daylight hours. This was more dangerous in some ways because the Germans now knew exactly what was happening. Air defenses were on full alert, and gliders were much more visible targets in daylight. Mission Chicago and Mission Detroit were part of the second wave. Hundreds of Waco gliders were flying toward Normandy. Inside them were artillery pieces, ammunition, communications equipment, and reinforcement troops. These gliders were bringing resources that the units on the beach desperately needed. But the landing zones were chaotic. There was wreckage from earlier battles, some areas were still in German hands, and air defenses were trying to shoot down the gliders. John Loudon was one of the pilots in the second wave. He was trying to land his glider near Sainte-Mère-Église. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy. His co-pilot was wounded by a piece of shrapnel, but Loudon didn't let go of the controls. He continued gliding, and finally he landed in the middle of a field. The landing was rough but successful. Loudon carried his wounded co-pilot and helped the soldiers in the back disembark. Then he grabbed his weapon and joined the nearest unit. Piloting was over. Now it was time to be a warrior. That day, American glider pilots showed incredible sacrifice. They landed under enemy fire. They carried the wounded. They brought reinforcements to the front. And then they grabbed their weapons and fought. Like their British counterparts, they too left their wings behind and became warriors of the earth. Subscribe and like for these heroes. But the story of glider pilots wasn't limited to D-Day. After the Normandy landings, these men continued fighting for weeks, even months, because their job description was different from ordinary pilots. They were soldiers who would fight to the end if necessary. The British glider pilot regiment participated in the Arnhem operation after Normandy. Also known as Operation Market Garden, this was the largest airborne operation of the war, and glider pilots again took on critical missions. At Arnhem, the situation was even worse than in Normandy. German resistance was stronger than expected. The landing zones were too far from the objectives, and reinforcement units couldn't arrive in time. Glider pilots fought for days in this chaotic environment. John Frost's unit had managed to capture the Arnhem Bridge, but they didn't have enough strength to hold it. Glider pilots joined this defense as well. For 4 days, they resisted German attacks coming from all directions. Ammunition ran out, food ran out, water ran out, but they didn't surrender. The Arnhem Bridge eventually fell, but the courage of the men who held out there went down in history, and glider pilots were part of this heroic epic. American glider pilots also continued fighting. They landed in Holland during Market Garden. Then, in December 1944, they took on resupply missions in the Ardennes, and in 1945, they served in the Rhine Crossing Operation, Operation Varsity. Operation Varsity was the largest single-day airborne operation in history. On March 24, 1945, thousands of paratroopers and glider pilots landed on the eastern bank of the Rhine. The objective was to capture the gateway that would open into the heart of Germany. In this operation, gliders took on bigger roles than ever before. Artillery, tanks, vehicles, all kinds of heavy equipment were transported by gliders, and the pilots shared the same fate once again. They landed, left their wings behind, and fought. George Peters was an American glider pilot who served in Operation Varsity. He managed to land his glider under heavy enemy fire, but they were near German trenches at the landing zone. Peters organized the soldiers in the back and launched an attack. They captured the German trenches, but Peters lost his life in this battle. George Peters was awarded the Medal of Honor for his courage. This medal was the highest honor the United States could give a soldier, and Peters was one of the rare glider pilots to receive it. He was proof of how brave the men who left their wings behind and fought on the ground could be. The fate of glider pilots is one of the most unique stories of World War II. These men were masters of the sky. Without engines, gliding silently, they landed in enemy territory. But the moment they touched the ground, they transformed into completely different people. They shed their wings, grabbed their weapons, and became warriors of the earth. Their story usually remains in the shadows. Paratroopers are more glamorous, Marines are more famous, but glider pilots were just as brave as them, perhaps even braver, because they fought in two different worlds, both in the sky and on the ground. Most of these men survived the war, but when they returned, they rarely told their stories. They stayed silent, they stayed humble, because for them, what they did was simply their duty, not heroism, just duty. But we know that what they did was heroism. We know that their courage played a critical role in the success of D-Day. We know that these men who left their wings behind changed the course of history. Now think about it. Would you agree to land in enemy territory in a motorless aircraft in the darkness of night, knowing you only had one chance, knowing there was no turning back? Would you take on this mission? And after landing, would you grab your weapon and jump into the trenches? Glider pilots did this. Every night, every operation, every mission. They were the silent heroes of World War II. In the third and final part, we'll see the post-war lives of these men. What did they experience when they returned home? How did society receive them? And why was glider piloting erased from history? We'll answer all these questions in the final part. Also, I'll let you in on a secret. The fate of glider pilots is part of a much bigger story than you might think, and in the final part, we'll open the doors to this bigger story. If you're curious, don't miss part 3. Now, like and subscribe. We're moving on to the final part. Welcome to the final part. We're continuing at full speed. The war was over. That terrible storm over Europe had finally subsided. The fire that had ravaged the continent for 5 years had been extinguished. Millions had died. Cities had been destroyed. Families had been torn apart. But now, peace had finally come, and the survivors were returning home. The harbors were filled with soldiers. Ships were carrying heroes back to their homelands. Trains, buses, every kind of vehicle was part of this great return. In Britain, in America, families were waiting for their loved ones. Flags were waving. Tears were flowing. This was the celebration of history's greatest victory. But for glider pilots, this return was different from the others. They had carried out one of the most dangerous missions of the war. They had landed in enemy territory in motorless wooden aircraft in the darkness of night. They had left their wings behind and fought from the trenches. They had been present at every critical operation, from Normandy to Arnhem, from Sicily to the Rhine. But now, as they returned home, they were met with a strange silence. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2 yet, stop now and go watch them, because this final part continues those stories. That unforgettable night at Pegasus Bridge, the chaos behind Utah Beach, the heroic resistance at Arnhem. The men who lived through all of this were now returning to civilian life. And their story didn't end on the battlefields. Perhaps their toughest battles began after they came home. The post-war fate of glider pilots began with a strange and painful silence. Paratroopers were declared heroes. The infantry who came off Omaha Beach became legends. Bomber pilots, submarine crews, tank units, they all told their stories, and society listened. Films were made, books were written, monuments were erected. But glider pilots? They somehow always remained in the shadows. There were several important reasons for this silence. The first, and perhaps most important, was that the profession of glider piloting completely disappeared after the war. Technology was changing at an incredible pace. Helicopters were coming, and they would change everything. Jet engines were fundamentally transforming aviation. Gliders would no longer be used as a military vehicle. They would be buried in the pages of history. And when a profession disappears, the heroes of that profession slowly begin to be forgotten. Do you remember Jim Walwork? He was the pilot of the first glider to land at Pegasus Bridge, the man who changed history. After the war, he returned to a normal life. He started working in the civilian aviation sector. He got married, had wonderful children, saw his grandchildren. But for years, he hardly spoke about that night at all. Even his family didn't know exactly what he had done for a long time. His children knew their father had been a pilot in the war, but they didn't know the details. Walwork kept those memories locked inside himself. But years later, when historians started knocking on his door, Walwork slowly began to talk. At first, he was reluctant. He didn't want to reopen old wounds. But the persistence of historians and society's need for these stories convinced him to speak. And as he talked, incredible details emerged. Every moment of that night, every emotion, every fear, and every victory. This story was true for many glider pilots. They quietly continued with their lives after the war. Some became farmers and worked the land. Some worked as laborers in factories. Some became teachers and raised future generations. Some opened small shops. They carried the deep scars of war, but they showed these scars to no one. They had nightmares at night. They relived the deaths of their friends over and over, but when they got up in the morning, they acted as if nothing had happened. Today, we call this post-traumatic stress disorder. Medical science defines this condition and develops treatment methods, but back then, there was no such concept. No one understood what these men were going through inside. When soldiers returned from war, they were expected to be strong. They were expected not to complain, not to cry, not to show weakness. They were just expected to continue with their lives. And glider pilots did just that. They suffered in silence. They tried to adapt in silence. They tried to forget in silence, or at least tried to pretend they had forgotten. But of course, their struggles were very difficult, even after the war. The situation of American glider pilots was even more complicated than their British counterparts, because the American military system could never quite figure out where to place glider pilots. Were they pilots or were they infantry? This classification ambiguity had caused serious problems even during the war. Glider pilots couldn't receive the bonuses that regular flight personnel received. Their hazard pay was inadequate. Their rank advancement was much slower than other pilots. And after the war, this injustice became even more pronounced. Even in veterans associations, glider pilots were treated as second class. Other pilots sometimes looked down on them. Infantry didn't quite consider them one of their own. Glider pilots were stuck between two worlds, neither fully pilots nor fully infantry. This identity ambiguity negatively affected their social recognition. This injustice was only addressed years later. The American Congress passed special resolutions recognizing the contributions of glider pilots to the war. Delayed medals were awarded, honorary ceremonies were held, presidents gave speeches of thanks. But this recognition came too late for most pilots. The vast majority of them had left this world without receiving the respect they deserved. Only their names were written on their tombstones, not their heroism. The British Glider Pilot Regiment was officially disbanded in 1957. 17 years of glorious history ended with the stroke of a pen. This regiment had been one of the most elite and courageous units of World War II. It had fought on every critical front, from the rocky shores of Sicily to the muddy fields of Normandy, from the bloody streets of Arnhem to the cold waters of the Rhine. But now, in the new world of the Cold War, it was being buried in the dusty pages of history. If you're enjoying this story, hit like and subscribe. The disbanding of the regiment was extremely painful for many former pilots. They took great pride in their sense of belonging to this regiment. The regiment was part of their identity. They had faced death together during the war, fought together, survived together. That badge, that emblem, that uniform symbolized sacred values to them, and now this unit was being officially eliminated. But the pilots were determined to maintain their strong bonds unofficially. They founded veterans associations. They organized regular reunions every year. They gathered in London, in small towns, sometimes at each other's homes. They told their stories to each other because no one else was listening or understood. At those meetings, aging eyes would sparkle. At those meetings, wrinkled faces would smile. At those meetings, lost friends were remembered and glasses were raised. Time marched on mercilessly, and the number of glider pilots decreased with each passing year. The inevitable law of biology was at work. Young men grew old. Old men fell ill and died one by one. Each funeral was a burial of a piece of history. Each loss was a story falling silent forever. Empty chairs multiplied at the annual reunions. The faces in the photographs now lived only in memories. And with them, stories began to disappear as well. Untold memories, unwritten letters, unshared experiences went to the grave. Historians were racing to record these stories before they were lost, but time always won in the end. But in recent years, things have begun to change. Historians, researchers, and documentary makers have begun to rediscover the story of glider pilots. Archives were opened, old documents came to light, long interviews were conducted with the last surviving pilots, books were written, academic papers were published, television documentaries were filmed. Pegasus Bridge was restored and turned into a museum. Every year at D-Day commemoration ceremonies, glider pilots are now specifically remembered. Late though it may be, these men finally began to receive the recognition they deserved. The Pegasus Bridge Museum has become one of the most visited historical sites in Normandy today. Every year, hundreds of thousands of visitors flock there. The museum displays a full-scale replica of a Horsa glider. Visitors can go inside this giant wooden bird. They can sit in that narrow cockpit, and in that moment they can understand just a little of what the pilots felt that night. Gliding down into enemy territory in the dark, without the sound of an engine, knowing you only have one chance, carrying the lives of dozens of soldiers behind you. This is a spine-tingling, breathtaking experience, even in the museum. Jim Walwork passed away in 2013. He was well past 90 years old. He had lived a long and full life. Before he died, he had visited Pegasus Bridge many times. That bridge was the most critical turning point of his life. There, that night, he had changed the course of history. And now a street next to that bridge bears his name, Jim Walwork Way. A small sign, but a great honor. John Howard, the legendary commander of the Pegasus Bridge operation, died in 1999. He was 80 years old. Shortly before his death, in an interview, he said this about the glider pilots: "Without them, we could never have reached that bridge. They carried us to the heart of enemy territory in the darkest moment of night. And then they fought shoulder to shoulder with us. They never complained, they never stepped back. They were the bravest and most humble men I ever knew. They were true heroes." These words perfectly summarize the story of glider pilots. They were the invisible heroes of the war. They descended silently from the sky, fought loudly on the ground, and then quietly faded into the pages of history. But their legacy did not die. At every D-Day commemoration, at every Arnhem ceremony, at every Pegasus Bridge visit, their spirit can still be felt there. Now I want to ask you a question. How many people really know this story? Ask the people around you, tell your friends, mention glider pilots to your family. How many of them know about them? How many have heard this name? Probably very few, perhaps none. And that is exactly why these stories must be told. Forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. Silent heroes deserve to have their voices heard. Thank you for watching this 3-part video series to the end. If the story of the glider pilots deeply affected you, I have a few requests for you. Like this video, because that's how the algorithm works. Subscribe to the channel, because more stories are coming. And write your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters. A like, a comment, a share helps these stories reach more people, and these heroes deserve to be remembered. Finally, I make you a promise. This channel will continue with determination to tell the stories of World War II's forgotten heroes. Glider pilots were just the beginning. There are many more stories to tell. There are many more heroes to remember, and I will share all of them with you. In the next video, I'm going to tell you a completely different story. Far from Normandy, across the ocean, on another front, other heroes were fighting. Their story will be as compelling as the glider pilots, perhaps even more surprising. If you're curious, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because that video will be live very soon, and you won't want to miss it. I promise. Remember, history is not just what happened in the past. History is what we remember, and we will continue to remember these heroes. See you soon. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.